I still remember the night it began, not because anything dramatic happened at first, but because of how strangely normal it felt. The air was cool, the neighborhood was quiet, and the kind of silence that usually helps me sleep felt unusually heavy, like the darkness itself was listening. I had been lying awake for hours, staring at the faint outline of the window across my room, unable to shake the feeling that something outside had shifted. It wasn't fear yet, just an uncomfortable awareness that the night felt wrong in a way I couldn't name. My house sits at the very end of a narrow residential lane, tucked behind a row of old houses that lean a little too close to the road. Windows face each other like pairs of watching eyes. The walls are thin, the gate is rusted, and the streetlights flicker, so often the whole place feels suspended between being alive and abandoned. Even on normal nights, sounds travel strangely here. Dogs bark at shadows, footsteps echo in ways that don't make sense, and sometimes you hear conversations even though no one is outside. It's the sort of place where you learn to ignore things to stay sane. But that night, something refused to be ignored. It started with a cry. Not a scream, not a shout, just a short, sharp cry that cut through the stillness like someone gasping after being startled. It came from the lane outside, close enough to freeze me in place. I remember sitting up instinctively, the blanket sliding off my legs as I listened, waiting for more. The air in my room felt colder, as if the walls were holding their breath. Then came another cry. This one longer, strained, almost panicked. It wasn't a child. It wasn't an animal. It sounded like an adult's voice, but filled with something I didn't recognize, something that made the hair on my arms rise. I swung my legs to the floor and stood there, unsure whether to approach the window or stay exactly where I was. Curiosity pulled me forward. When I finally reached the window, I only allowed myself to look with one eye around the curtain, scared of what I might see. The lane looked empty. The streetlight was flickering, casting slow pulses of dim orange light on the cracked road. Nothing moved, yet the cry came again, sharper this time, as if the person was closer to my gate. My heart was thudding so loudly I worried the sound might attract whoever was outside. I tried to make sense of the noise, telling myself it could be someone drunk, someone arguing, someone playing a prank. But the cries had no words in them, no rhythm, no pattern. They sounded instinctive, desperate, almost like someone calling for help without having the breath or clarity to form actual sentences. I checked my phone, but the battery was nearly dead. Even if I could call someone, I didn't know who. I didn't want to wake my family or step out of my room, but standing by the window wasn't helping either. I felt trapped inside my own house, unsure whether danger was outside or just inside my imagination. The next cry was different. Shorter, quieter, closer. I stepped back from the window so fast I nearly tripped. There was no mistaking it anymore. The sound wasn't coming from the lane. It was directly on the other side of my gate. Someone was outside my house in the middle of the night, crying in that strange, broken way, and I had no idea what they wanted. I moved toward my door, thinking of waking someone, but the corridor outside my room was pitch black. I could make out nothing except the faint glow from the nightlight downstairs. That glow looked too far away, too dim to reach in time if something suddenly went wrong. I stood frozen, staring into that darkness, feeling as though someone else was staring back at me. The cry came again, softer now, almost pleading. I forced myself to return to the window, even though every instinct told me not to. My hand shook as I lifted the curtain slightly. Outside, the streetlight flickered again, but for a brief second it stayed bright long enough for me to see something I will never forget. There was a figure standing directly in front of my gate. Not moving, not walking, just standing there. The glow from the streetlight made it impossible to see their face, but I could make out the shape of their body and the way their arms hung stiffly at their sides. They looked like they were staring straight at my house, maybe even at my window. I held my breath, afraid the slightest movement would give me away. The figure didn't cry this time. They didn't do anything at all. They simply stood there in complete stillness for several seconds, and I felt a cold pressure build inside my chest, as if the air around me had turned to ice. I dropped the curtain and backed away slowly, terrified that they had seen me looking. My room felt suffocating then, the kind of closed space where every shadow seemed to shift. I waited for another sound, another cry, another sign that the person outside was moving. For a while there was nothing. No footsteps, no rustling, not even wind. Just silence, thick and unnatural. And then I heard it. Not a cry this time. Breathing. Slow, controlled breathing. Right outside my window. I couldn't bring myself to look. I couldn't even move. I stood in the center of my room, unable to do anything but listen as that measured breathing continued for what felt like forever. I wanted to scream for help, but no sound came out of my throat. My skin felt numb, my chest tight. I kept repeating in my head that maybe I was imagining it, maybe it was just the wind or an animal or something else entirely. But deep down, I knew the truth. Someone was outside my window. Someone who had stopped crying. Someone who was now perfectly calm. Eventually, after what felt like an hour, the breathing faded. There were no footsteps. No gate opening. It just disappeared, as if the person had never been there at all. The silence returned, but it felt worse now, heavier and suffocating, like something was still lingering even if I couldn't hear it anymore. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the floor with my back against the bed, watching the sky lighten slowly behind the curtains. When morning finally came, I gathered the courage to go outside. I expected to find footprints, or something left behind, anything that proved I hadn't imagined the whole thing. But there was nothing. No marks on the road, no signs of forced entry, not even the usual stray litter that collects near the gate. The ground was perfectly clean, as if no one had walked there at all. I tried to convince myself that maybe my mind had played tricks on me, but I couldn't shake one detail that made the whole thing impossible to forget. The lock on my gate, the one that always hangs straight down, was twisted sideways. Not broken, not forced, just turned in a way it never turns on its own. Almost like someone had held onto it for a long time. And the strangest part is what I learned later that day. Another neighbor at the far end of the lane said they heard crying around the same time. But they said it wasn't coming from outside. They said it sounded like it was coming from inside someone's house. The night it happened is one I still replay in my mind when the house gets too quiet, because every time I think about it, I realize how easily everything could have gone worse. It was the kind of night where the air felt heavier than usual, thick enough that even breathing felt slow. I remember lying in bed, staring up at the ceiling fan turning in lazy circles, feeling an odd tension building in the silence, as if the entire house was waiting for something to happen. I had no reason to feel uneasy, but a small, restless part of me refused to settle. It was close to midnight when the first sound broke through the stillness. It wasn't a loud cry. It was a faint, shaky noise that rose and fell like someone trying not to be heard. At first I thought it was just a stray animal in the alley, but the tone was too human, too close, too intentional. I pushed myself up on my elbows and listened harder. The sound came again, slightly louder this time, and my heartbeat started to pick up. It was coming from the side of the house where the old storage shed sat, the one we barely used and never bothered to lock because nothing important was inside. I sat frozen, trying to make sense of it. The shed was at least 15 meters from my window, shielded by overgrown grass and rusted tools we never fully cleaned up. No one had any reason to go near it. The neighborhood had been calm for months, no trouble, no break-ins, no unusual activity. But the noise coming from there wasn't random. It had rhythm, hesitation, and a kind of shivering pain that made my skin feel cold. I walked slowly to my window and pushed the curtain aside, just enough to see outside. The backyard was dimly lit by the moonlight, pale and sharp like washed-out silver. Shadows from the trees stretched across the grass in long, distorted shapes. The shed was partially covered in darkness, its door slightly open, swaying gently as if it had been nudged. The cry came again, this time clearly from inside the shed. I should have woken someone. That was the obvious thing to do. But I didn't. Instead, I kept staring, unable to move, caught between fear and curiosity. Something about the sound felt wrong, not just frightening, but unnatural for a human voice producing it. It had no words, no breath between syllables, no emotion you could easily name. It was like someone trying to cry while also trying to keep completely still. I forced myself to step back from the window and grab my phone, but the battery was dead. The charger was downstairs. Going down meant passing through the hallway that creaked with every step. It also meant walking past the large rear-facing window that always showed a warped reflection at night, something I hated seeing when I was alone. I stayed in my room instead, holding my breath as I listened. The cry stopped. Silence once again filled the space, heavier than before. I felt the hairs on my neck rise as I waited for another sound. Instead of crying, I heard something else. A faint dragging noise, like someone shifting their weight across the rough concrete floor of the shed. A slow scrape, then a pause, then another scrape. My throat tightened. I backed up until I hit my desk, keeping my eyes locked on the window, as if something might appear at any moment. The dragging stopped. For several long seconds, there was nothing. Not a rustle, not a step, not even the rustling of leaves. Then the shed door creaked open further with a sound that made my stomach twist. There was no wind strong enough to do that. The door moved slowly, deliberately, until it hung wide enough for someone to walk through. The moonlight hit the entrance, but nothing came out. I waited. 30 seconds. A minute. 2 minutes. Still nothing. I thought maybe whoever was inside had silently slipped out while I blinked or shifted my gaze. I thought maybe the sound had been an illusion, just my mind producing horrors in the quiet. But then the cry came again. Not from the shed this time. From directly beneath my window. My breath stopped in my chest. I didn't dare move. The sound was soft, trembling, but unmistakably close. Too close. It sounded like someone crouching right below the windowsill, released from the shadows of the shed and now hidden just out of sight. I stepped back slowly, praying that the wooden floor wouldn't betray me with a creak. The cry shifted again, changing into a low, controlled exhale. No shaking this time. No pain. Just a steady release of breath, as if the person outside my window had suddenly calmed. I didn't understand how someone could cry so desperately one moment and then become so utterly still the next. That kind of calmness didn't feel human. I backed into the far corner of my room, keeping my eyes trained on the lower edge of the window. If a hand or face appeared there, I didn't know what I would do. The breathing continued in a steady rhythm, almost too steady. It felt like the person was waiting for something, maybe listening for movement inside the room. I pressed my back against the wall, barely daring to breathe. Minutes passed. The breathing was patient, unchanging. And then, without warning, it stopped. No footstep. No rustle of grass. No retreating sound. Just silence again, as if the person had vanished into the air. I waited, muscles tight, afraid to look outside, but even more afraid not to. When I finally gathered the courage to peek through the curtain, the yard was empty. The shed door was now fully open, exposing the dark interior. Nothing else moved. I didn't sleep at all after that. I stayed awake until the first hints of sunrise touched the rooftops. Only then did I allow myself to go outside. The air smelled sharp and cold. The grass had a strange pattern pressed into it, not like footsteps, but like someone had crawled instead of walked. The shed was completely empty except for a few old tools scattered across the floor, as if someone had dragged them and then abandoned them midway. I stood there, staring at the ground, trying to understand the pattern. That was when I noticed the dirt under the window. There were marks in it. Not fingerprints. Not footprints. Something else. Something wide and irregular, pressed deep like someone had been gripping the earth with both hands. I asked the neighbors later that day if they heard anything strange the previous night. Most said no. One elderly neighbor said yes, but not in a way that made sense to me. They said they hadn't heard crying. They heard someone breathing heavily outside their bedroom window. They thought it was a thief until the breathing moved away too fast to follow. When they told me the time it happened, my chest tightened. It was the exact moment the breathing beneath my window had stopped. The night I remember most clearly didn't begin with a sound. It began with a feeling. A quiet, creeping tension that settled into the house long before anything actually happened. I had been sitting at my desk finishing some work, barely aware of the time, when I suddenly noticed how still the air had become. It wasn't silence that bothered me. It was the kind of stillness that feels intentional, as if the night is waiting for someone to make the first move. I glanced at the clock and realized it was just a few minutes past midnight. My room overlooks the narrow alley beside our house, a cramped space bordered by high concrete walls that form a sort of corridor between the properties. The alley is barely wide enough for a person to walk through without turning sideways. It stays dark even in the daytime, and at night it is almost pitch black, lit only by the faint glow of a distant street lamp. I've never liked that alley. It has always felt too quiet, too forgotten, as if it remembers things the rest of the neighborhood doesn't. While I worked, that uneasy pressure grew stronger. At first I tried to ignore it, telling myself I was just tired, but the feeling wouldn't leave. It stayed with me like an invisible weight, nudging me toward the window, even though I didn't want to look outside. Eventually I gave in and stood up from my chair, convincing myself I was just letting my mind play tricks on me. The moment I reached the window, I heard it for the first time. A cry. Faint. Thin. Almost swallowed by the night. I froze, leaning slightly toward the glass to listen more carefully. The cry came again, this time sharper, as if someone was struggling to contain their breath. It didn't sound like a child or an animal. It sounded like an adult trying not to break down, the kind of sound someone makes when they are cornered or terrified. My heart skipped a beat. The cry was coming from the alley. I stepped back instinctively. Very few people ever walked through that alley, and absolutely no one should have been there at midnight. The neighbors kept their gates locked, and our own gate to that side passage was always bolted from the inside. There was no logical reason for anyone to be out there. The cry returned again, louder this time, echoing strangely between the concrete walls. It had a trembling edge that made my stomach tighten. I reached for my phone out of habit, but it wasn't on my desk. I remembered I had left it downstairs earlier in the evening. I hesitated. Going downstairs meant walking past the back door that led directly to the alley, and the thought alone made my skin crawl. Another cry rose up, cutting through the silence like a blade. I approached the window, but I moved slowly, carefully, as though something outside might sense me if I rushed. I lifted the curtain just enough to see. The alley was dark, a long black shape stretching between the houses. At first I saw nothing, just shadows and the uneven surface of the wall across from me. I waited. The cry came again. It wasn't ahead of me this time. It was below me. Someone was standing directly beneath my window. I held my breath and forced my eyes downward, following the line of the wall until I saw a figure pressed against the concrete. They weren't moving. They weren't pacing or crying into their hands. They were standing perfectly still with their forehead against the wall, as if listening to something inside the bricks. Their shoulders rose and fell with shaky breaths, but everything else was unnervingly still. I stepped back, heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I didn't understand why someone would stand like that, pressed against a wall in the dead of night, crying without moving a single muscle. My first thought was that maybe they were injured, but the posture didn't look like pain. It looked deliberate, like they were trying to hide. The cry came again, but this time it was different. It didn't sound desperate anymore. It was calmer, quieter, as if the person had regained control of their breath. My mind raced through different possibilities. Was it a neighbor? Was it someone lost? Was it someone trying to break in? I didn't know, and the fear of not knowing made every second feel unbearable. I backed away from the window and sat on my bed, trying to steady my breathing. For a few moments I heard nothing. Then came a new sound. Not a cry, not a breath. A slow, dragging scrape against the wall. I stood up again, my legs trembling. I shouldn't have looked. Every instinct told me not to. But curiosity mixed with fear has a strange pull. It drags you forward, even when you know it will only make things worse. I approached the window again and looked down. The figure was no longer standing against the wall. They were facing the house. Their head was tilted slightly upward, as though they were listening for movement inside my room. I couldn't see their face. The shadows covered it completely. All I could make out was the outline of their body, and the odd way they held their arms close to their sides, stiff and unmoving. The scraping sound had been from their shoe dragging across the ground as they turned around. I dropped the curtain immediately. Darkness swallowed the room, and I felt a rush of cold air against my skin even though the window was shut. I sat on the floor, pressing my back against the bed frame, trying not to make a sound. Every few seconds I strained to hear something from outside, afraid that the person might try to climb or knock or speak. But there was nothing. No footsteps. No breathing. No scraping. Just silence. A silence that felt wrong. Minutes passed. Maybe 10. Maybe 20. Eventually the tension became unbearable, and I crawled forward to peek again through the smallest gap in the curtain. The alley was empty. The person was gone. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I stayed awake until dawn, when the first light finally pushed the shadows back. Only then did I gather the courage to go outside. The alley was eerily quiet. The concrete under my window had faint smudges, marks like someone had been leaning hard against the wall. I followed them and noticed something else, footprints leading to the end of the alley. They stopped at my gate, but the gate was still locked from the inside. I stood there in the early morning light, staring at the undisturbed bolt, and felt a slow, heavy dread settle in my stomach. Whoever had stood beneath my window that night hadn't come through the gate. They had already been inside the alley long before I heard the first cry. The night everything shifted for me didn't begin with a noise or a shadow. It began with a strange feeling in my chest, a quiet pull that made me pause halfway through brushing my teeth. The house felt wrong. Not dangerous yet, not frightening, just off. The kind of off where even the air seems to hold itself differently, as if something has changed in a way you cannot see but your body knows anyway. I stood there in the dim bathroom light, toothbrush still in my mouth, listening without knowing what I was listening for. It was just past midnight. Everyone else in the house had gone to bed hours earlier. My room was on the second floor, at the far end of the hallway, next to the landing where the staircase turned sharply before descending to the main floor. That landing always gave me an uneasy feeling at night. The shadows there felt deeper than anywhere else, like the space held something too still to be normal. But that night, it felt heavier than usual. I finished brushing my teeth, turned off the bathroom light, and began walking toward my room. I had only taken a few steps when I felt the temperature drop slightly. A faint draft, just enough to make my skin prick. The windows were closed. The doors were shut. There shouldn't have been any wind at all. I paused near the staircase and leaned slightly over the railing. The lower floor looked normal, quiet, untouched. The faint glow of the nightlight in the living room cast soft rings across the furniture. Nothing moved. Nothing made a sound. I told myself I was overthinking things and went to my room. I shut the door gently, got into bed, and tried to settle in. The silence felt deeper than usual. Even the distant sounds from outside were muted. Minutes passed. My breathing slowed. Eventually I felt myself start to relax. Then I heard it. A cry. Soft, strained, trembling. It came from downstairs. I shot upright immediately, heart hammering. I waited, frozen, unsure if I had imagined it. But it came again, a bit clearer this time. A short cry, almost like someone gasping sharply in pain or fear. It sounded like it came from the living room, directly beneath the landing outside my door. My first instinct was to get up and wake my parents. But something held me still. The cry didn't sound loud enough to be someone in real distress. It sounded controlled, held back, almost like someone trying to remain quiet despite not wanting to. I slipped out of bed and crept toward my door. I opened it just enough to look out into the hallway. The landing was half lit by the faint glow drifting up from below. A cold pressure gathered at the base of my neck as I stared at it, waiting for movement. The cry rose again, not from the living room, from the stairs. I stepped back involuntarily. The sound had shifted, climbing upward just slightly, as though the person had moved closer. I didn't hear footsteps. No creaking, no shuffling, just that soft cry drifting a little nearer. I knew I should wake someone. I knew I should call out. But fear works differently at night. It doesn't push you into action. It roots you where you stand, making every breath feel too loud. I backed away from the door and pressed myself against the wall, listening. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then I heard it. A faint footstep on the wooden stair. Not a heavy one. Not a confident one. A slow, dragging step, like someone testing the surface before putting their weight on it. Another cry followed, quieter now but unmistakably closer. I reached for my phone on the bedside table, but my hand was shaking. Before I could unlock it, another step sounded from the staircase. Then another. Slow, cautious, too controlled to be accidental. The person was moving up the stairs. My chest tightened. I strained to hear anything else, breathing, whispering, movement. But there was nothing except those deliberate steps and the occasional soft cry breaking the silence like a cracked breath. I crept to my door again and held my breath as I peeked through the crack. The landing was empty, but I could see part of the staircase below. A faint shadow moved against the wall. Too faint to make out details, but enough to know someone was there. The next step sounded directly beneath the landing. I shut the door silently and backed away, heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. I didn't know what to do. If I called out, I might draw attention to myself. If I tried to run to my parents' room, I'd have to pass the landing, and whoever was climbing the stairs. I stood in the middle of my room, staring at the door, every muscle tight. Then the crying stopped. The silence felt instantly worse. Heavy, pressured, like the air was thickening. I moved backward until I bumped into my desk. My hand brushed against the edge of a flashlight, but the thought of turning it on and drawing attention to myself was terrifying. I waited, and then, without warning, the faintest sound broke the quiet. Breathing. Slow, controlled, steady. It was coming from right outside my door. I felt the blood drain from my face. The breathing wasn't desperate or panicked. It was measured, calm, like someone standing perfectly still just inches away from me, listening for any sign of movement inside the room. I didn't dare breathe. I didn't dare make a sound. The breathing continued for several seconds, then paused. A soft rustle followed, like fabric shifting slightly. Then another faint exhale. A slow, soft cry escaped whoever was standing outside. I nearly collapsed from fear. I pressed myself against the wall, gripping the desk so hard my fingers hurt. I stared at the door, expecting the handle to turn or a shadow to shift beneath it. But nothing happened. The breathing stayed steady. Then, after what felt like a lifetime, it stopped. Silence took over again. I waited. 1 minute. 2 minutes. 5. Nothing moved. Eventually, when I could no longer stand the tension, I approached the door slowly, painfully slow, and leaned in to listen. Nothing. I pressed my eye against the crack. The landing was empty. I stayed awake until dawn. When the sky finally began to lighten, I opened the door fully and stepped into the hallway. The air felt normal again. The house was quiet in a familiar way. I crept to the landing and looked down the stairs. Everything was still, but something caught my eye at the base of the staircase. A small smudge on the wooden step. A faint, greasy mark shaped like the outline of a heel. Not a footprint, just the back curve of one, as if someone had pressed their foot too cautiously, too slowly, as they climbed the stairs. I stared at it for a long time. Our staircase doesn't have marks like that. None of us walked barefoot at night. And the door to the outside, it was still locked from the inside. Whoever had been climbing the stairs had already been inside the house long before I heard the first cry. The memory of that night creeps back into my mind every time I sit alone in my room after midnight. It was supposed to be a normal evening, nothing special at all. I had been studying at my desk, trying to finish an assignment that was already overdue, when I felt the temperature shift ever so slightly. A thin chill slipped through the room like a draft from an unseen crack. I looked up from my notes, expecting to see the curtain moving or the window slightly open, but everything was still. The air felt too heavy, as if the room had tightened around me. I tried to ignore it at first, but something deep inside me wouldn't settle. The hairs on my arms rose without any obvious reason. I wasn't scared yet, only restless, the kind of discomfort that grows in the quietest parts of the night. I leaned back in my chair and listened. The neighborhood outside was silent except for the occasional bark of a distant dog. Nothing unusual, nothing strange, but the feeling wouldn't go away. My window faces the side yard where a tall hedge runs along the fence, forming a narrow passage between our house and the property next door. It's the kind of space where sound echoes strangely, where even a sigh can seem louder than it should. I walked toward the window to see if maybe an animal had brushed against the bushes. I was a few steps away when it happened. A cry pierced the silence. Short, sharp, trembling. I froze mid-step, my pulse slamming into my throat. I waited, heart thudding, trying to figure out where it had come from. For a moment I thought it was just some noise carried by the wind. But then it came again, more controlled this time, soft but unmistakably human. I moved even slower now, approaching the window with a tightness in my chest that made breathing difficult. I didn't pull the curtain aside immediately. I stood there, staring at the thin fabric, my mind running through every explanation I could invent. Maybe it was someone walking by, maybe a neighbor, maybe someone in the street. But the cry hadn't come from the street. It had come from the hedge. When I finally gathered enough courage, I lifted a corner of the curtain and peered out into the narrow passage. At first, all I saw were the shifting shadows of the hedge, swaying slightly in the breeze. The moonlight filtered unevenly through the branches, creating patches of moving darkness. I scanned the length of the yard slowly, trying not to blink. Then the cry came again, this time from directly below the window. I jerked back, dropping the curtain instantly. My breath caught in my throat. The cry had been softer, almost like someone trying not to be heard, but failing to hold it in. I backed away from the window until my legs hit the edge of the bed. I sat down hard, gripping the blanket with both hands. My mind raced. Someone was standing in that narrow space. Someone close enough to touch the wall of the house. Someone beneath my window crying softly into the dark. I swallowed hard and tried to calm my breathing. Maybe the person needed help. Maybe they were hurt or confused. But something about the cry felt off. Not just frightened. It felt cautious, too controlled in its trembling, as though the person knew exactly how loud they were being. After a minute of suffocating silence, I forced myself to stand. I took a slow step toward the window. Another, then another. My fingers trembled as I lifted the curtain again, barely enough to see outside. The passage was empty, or at least it looked empty at first. I squinted, letting my eyes adjust to the darkness. The hedge cast deep shadows along the wall. Nothing moved. Nothing breathed. I exhaled shakily, thinking maybe the person had slipped away into the darkness before I looked. But the moment I began to lower the curtain, I saw it. A shape. A figure pressed against the hedge, so still it almost blended with the leaves. I couldn't see the face. I could barely make out the shoulders and the faint outline of a head. But the angle was unmistakable. The person was facing the house, facing my window, standing so close that the branches of the hedge touched their back. Before I could react, the figure shifted slightly. Not forward, not backward, just enough to let the moonlight glide across a portion of their cheek. The movement was slow, deliberate, the kind of motion that isn't meant to be noticed unless someone is watching closely. I dropped the curtain a second time and stumbled backward. Fear washed over me like ice water. I couldn't think clearly. Every instinct screamed at me to run to my parents' room, but I couldn't get my body to move. It felt safer to stay still, hoping whoever was out there hadn't actually seen me. Then the crying started again. Not loud, not desperate. A quiet, contained cry that rose and fell with eerie precision. It was coming from right outside the window. I backed into the far corner of the room and slid down the wall, pulling my knees close to my chest. My breathing trembled. I focused on staying silent. The crying didn't stop. It continued in soft waves, as if the person outside was waiting for something. Waiting for a reaction. Waiting for movement inside the room. Minutes dragged by. Then the crying stopped. Silence settled again, thick and unbearable. And then I heard something far worse. Breathing. Slow, steady breathing, just on the other side of the glass. I covered my mouth with both hands, afraid any sound would be too loud. The breathing continued for what felt like forever. Calm, patient, measured, as if the person outside wasn't in pain at all, as if they were simply listening. At last, the breathing faded. A rustle of leaves followed. Then nothing. I didn't move until dawn. When the sun finally rose, I stood on shaking legs and forced myself to look outside. The passage was empty. The bushes were still. But on the ground, right below the window, I saw something that made my stomach twist. Two faint impressions in the dirt. Not footprints. Knee marks. As if someone had knelt there for a long time. Later that day, I overheard my neighbor telling someone else about a noise they heard around midnight. A soft cry outside their window. They thought it was a stray animal at first, until they noticed something else. A tall figure standing perfectly still beside their fence, facing their house. At the same time I heard the crying beneath my window. I still remember the sound that pulled me out of sleep that night, sharp enough to slice through the kind of deep exhaustion that usually keeps me dead to the world. It wasn't a dream, and it wasn't the wind. It was a cry, thin and strained, like someone trying to hold back pain while still begging for help. Even now, years later, the memory floats into my mind on nights I can't sleep, a reminder of the moment everything changed for me. Sometimes I wonder if sharing it will free me a little, or if it will only remind me that I never really escaped what happened. The night had been colder than usual, the kind of cold that settles into the walls and makes the entire house feel unfamiliar. I had gone to bed late, after scrolling on my phone far longer than I should have. My room was dark except for the faint glow from the street lamp outside filtering through my curtains. I remember thinking that the house felt unusually still, like it was holding its breath. I didn't dwell on it. I pulled the blanket tight and fell asleep fast, heavy from the day. The cry came sometime after midnight. At first I wasn't even sure if I'd heard something real. I lay frozen in bed, listening. There was nothing, just the refrigerator hum downstairs and the tiny creaks of the house settling. I almost convinced myself it was just a dream bleeding into waking. But then it came again. This one was clearer. A quiet, trembling plea that carried a shaking edge, like someone trying hard not to be loud. I pushed myself up slowly, heart building speed before my mind caught up. I lived with my older brother and my mother. She worked nights often, meaning the house was usually silent after dark. My brother slept like a stone, so any noise like that had to be coming from outside. The window was closest. I remember stepping toward it even though something deep in me whispered that I shouldn't. The street below looked normal. A stray dog rummaged through a pile of plastic, a motorcycle glinted beneath the street lamp, and nothing seemed out of place. But when I leaned closer, I heard the cry again. It wasn't loud. If anything, it was too soft, as if whoever made it didn't want the world to hear but couldn't stop themselves. It came from the alley beside our house, the narrow passage lined with old bricks and a rusted metal gate at the end. My heartbeat echoed in my ears. I should have woken my brother, but something kept me still. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe fear, maybe the strange, unexplainable feeling that whatever was happening out there had already noticed me. Another cry, this one quicker, like it had been cut short. I moved back from the window and stood in the middle of my room, debating what to do. The logical part of me said to lock the door and stay quiet. But something else pushed me forward. That cry hadn't sounded like danger directed at me. It had sounded like someone who desperately needed help. I stepped into the hallway, the wooden floor cold under my feet. The house felt even quieter than before, like the air itself had thickened. My brother's door was closed, and I hesitated outside it, but I didn't knock. I couldn't explain it even to myself. Instead, I made my way slowly down the stairs, each step stretching my breath thinner. At the bottom, I could hear it more clearly. Not crying now, but muffled movement, like someone shifting their weight, trying desperately not to make noise. The sound seeped through the kitchen window that overlooked the alley. When I reached the window, I pressed my back to the wall first, forcing myself to breathe. I edged closer and peeked out through the gap where the curtain didn't fully cover the glass. The alley looked empty. Just the cracked pavement, the tall shadows of the surrounding walls, and the faint reflection of my own face in the glass. But then I noticed it, a shape near the far corner beside the gate. Small, hunched, almost blending into the dark. Someone was crouched there, holding onto their leg like they were injured. They rocked slightly, shoulders trembling. I felt a sudden chill climb my spine. There was something wrong about the way they moved, like they were fighting to stay quiet. And then, before I could think, their head lifted. They were looking straight at me. I stumbled back from the window so fast I nearly slipped. My breath caught in a sharp gasp, and my pulse thrashed wildly. The figure hadn't moved from their spot, but the way they had turned their head felt unnatural, too fast for someone in pain. I pressed my palm over my mouth to steady my breathing. I told myself to go back to my room. I told myself to wake my brother. But instead I found myself inching forward again. The space outside was empty. No crouching figure. No movement. Just the alley and the cold glow of the street lamp. I stared, unable to understand how they could have vanished in the span of a breath. The gate was still closed. There was no sound of running or stumbling. Nothing. I closed the curtain and stepped back, uneasy twisting inside me. I turned to head upstairs, determined to forget everything, when a new sound rose behind me. Not outside. Inside the house. It was soft at first, like fabric dragging lightly across the floor. I froze. The sound came again, closer this time, moving slowly through the hallway that led to the back door. A faint shuffle, then another. I felt the air grow colder, heavier, as if the entire house had shifted into some unfamiliar version of itself. I backed toward the stairs, trying not to make a sound. My mind screamed to run, but my body wouldn't respond. Every muscle locked as the shuffling sound grew clearer, as if someone was dragging their feet quietly, cautiously, like they didn't want to be heard but couldn't stay still. I reached the first step and pressed my heel down softly, trying not to let it creak. The sound stopped. I didn't breathe, didn't blink. Then I heard something that haunts me more than the cry, more than the movement, more than the sight of that figure in the alley. It was the sound of someone exhaling shakily right behind the kitchen doorway, like they had been holding their breath and finally let it slip out. I didn't wait. I bolted up the stairs, my footsteps loud, uncontrolled. I rushed into my room and locked the door, my chest burning. I pressed my ear against the wood, waiting, listening. The house was silent again, but it wasn't the normal kind of silence. It felt like something was hiding inside it. I stayed awake until sunrise, staring at the window, flinching at every creak. My mother came home in the morning, surprised to see me pale and shaken. I never told her everything. I never told anyone about what I saw or heard. But the next night, when I walked past the alley on my way home, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. The gate at the end was slightly open, and on the pavement just inside, there was a dark smear. Dried, almost invisible, but unmistakably blood. And it wasn't the stain that frightened me most. It was the faint outline of a footprint beside it, a single footprint pointing toward our house. I have learned that a sound can scar you just as deeply as anything you see. People think fear comes from images, shadows, silhouettes, things you can point to. But the truth is that the sounds you hear when you are alone, the ones that slip under your door and settle in your bones, are the ones that come back years later. That is why I still wake up some nights thinking I hear that same broken cry echoing in the hallway, even though I know it isn't real. Or at least, I hope it isn't. The night it happened was one of those nights where everything feels slightly off from the start. You know the kind, when the air feels too still, when even the dogs outside barely bark, when the world seems to hold itself tight like it is waiting for something. I had spent the evening studying in the living room, the warm glow from the bulb making the corners of the room look darker than usual. I remember feeling restless, unable to focus, checking the clock every few minutes for no real reason. My mother was working a late shift again, and my younger cousin was asleep in the room down the hall. I was supposed to keep an ear out for him, since he had been having nightmares lately. At the time, I thought the house felt heavy because I was tired. Maybe if I had listened to that feeling, I would have locked myself in my room and refused to leave. I went to bed after midnight. The moment I lay down, something felt wrong. It was the silence. Not the normal kind, but a deeper, almost pressing quiet that made me breathe a little softer. I tried to ignore it, telling myself I was being dramatic. I closed my eyes and eventually drifted off. I remember the way my body instantly relaxed, sinking into the mattress like I had been holding tension all day without noticing. I woke up to a cry. It wasn't loud. It wasn't high-pitched. It was muffled, like someone trying to scream into their own hands. A short, shaky burst of sound that faded before my mind fully surfaced from sleep. I sat up instantly, my heart stumbling. For a moment, I wasn't sure if I had dreamed it. The room was dark except for the faint bluish glow leaking through the curtains. My breath felt too loud. I held it, listening. Another cry. This one shorter, broken in the middle, as if whoever made it had been startled or silenced. My first thought was my cousin. I pushed off the blanket and stepped into the hallway. The air felt colder than it should have been. My bare feet pressed against the tiles, and a small shiver ran up my legs. His door was halfway open. I nudged it with my fingertips and peered in. He was asleep, breathing steadily, his arm hanging off the bed like he had shifted around before dozing off again. The room was untouched, undisturbed, so the cry hadn't come from him. I backed away slowly, trying to steady my breathing. I should have gone back to my room. I should have shut the door and stayed there. But I kept thinking about the sound. There had been fear in it, a kind of strained desperation that didn't feel like a nightmare mutter or sleep talk. It felt real, too real. The next cry came from downstairs. I felt the blood drain from my face. It wasn't loud, but it carried. A trembling choke of a sound, like someone fighting the urge to scream. I forced myself down the stairs, each step cold and sharp beneath my feet. The living room was dark, the faint outline of the sofa barely visible. I didn't turn on the lights. Something about doing that felt too bold, like it would announce my presence. I stood in the middle of the living room, trying to pinpoint where the sound had come from. The kitchen? The back entrance? Outside? The house felt like it had grown eyes, watching me from every corner. My heartbeat pounded against my ribs, so hard it felt like it belonged to someone else. I heard movement. Not footsteps. More like a quick shuffle, fabric brushing against a surface. It came from the direction of the back door. There was a window there that looked into the narrow backyard passage. I took a breath that felt too shaky and stepped closer, pressing my back against the wall before leaning enough to look out through the tiny gap in the curtain. At first, I saw nothing. Then I saw the shadow. Someone was crouched near the edge of the yard, just out of full view, their outline jerking slightly like they were breathing unevenly. The moonlight wasn't bright enough to show details, but I could see the curve of their shoulders, the angle of their arm bracing against the ground. They seemed hurt, or hiding, or both. My breath caught when they shifted and the faintest hint of a face turned toward the door. I couldn't see the eyes, but I felt the weight of their attention. And then, without warning, the shadow snapped out of view, slipping from the yard's angle like they had been pulled or had darted away. I stepped back so fast I hit the wall. The sound of my shoulder striking the plaster echoed far too loudly in the quiet house. I froze, waiting to hear something else, anything else. Nothing came. After a long, shaking moment, I made myself return to the stairs. I reached the bottom step when I heard it again. A cry, but this time it was inside. Not far, not muffled. This one came from the hallway behind me. My entire body locked. It wasn't a scream. It was more like the beginning of one, quickly smothered, like someone pressing their hand over their own mouth. I didn't move. I didn't blink. Slowly, painfully slowly, I turned my head just enough to see the hallway. Someone was standing there. A figure tall, hunched slightly forward, arms hanging stiffly at their sides. The faint light from the window behind them made their shape look unreal. I wanted to scream, but the sound died in my throat. The figure didn't move. It only breathed, a slow, heavy exhale that felt far too close. I didn't wait to see more. I bolted up the stairs, hands shaking so hard I almost slipped. I reached my room and slammed the door, locking it with trembling fingers. I pressed myself against it, breathing so fast my chest hurt. I listened. The hallway outside was silent. Too silent. I didn't dare open the door. I didn't dare make a sound. I stayed there until dawn, muscles cramped, eyes wide. When morning finally came, I checked every room. My cousin was still asleep. The house was still. Nothing was out of place, except for the back door. The lock was turned. Not broken. Not forced. Just turned. Someone had unlocked it from the inside. Later, when I went outside with my mother after she got home, she noticed something I missed. Near the edge of the yard, where I had seen the shadow crouching, there were faint marks on the ground. Not footprints exactly. More like the pattern made by someone kneeling for too long, shifting their weight as if trying not to collapse. And beside it, scratched lightly into the dirt, was a single line. A drag mark leading straight toward the back door. I still don't know who was in our house that night, but I know one thing. They weren't crying for help. They were crying because they knew they weren't supposed to be seen. And I think they realized I had seen them first.